like, okay, we'll kind of just sort of play that right here and sort of throw them in there and bring them in and that kind of thing. Let's see, what happened? Oh, okay, so spirometry is on for Tuesday. Good. We're having some issues with the equipment for this lab. We kind of stayed after, the lab tech and I stayed after to sort of go through them, and we're having some issues with that stuff. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that one. I hope it does. It's kind of a fun one, but we'll see. And then we'll throw in the other ones. This one where it says vitals group graphs, I hope you guys saved your vitals labs that you had turned in and then I turned them back. Did everybody, I hope, save those graphs? Huh? So we'll see. All right. Be sure you can kind of dig that up. Right? I'll explain later when we get closer. But I would like us to, kind of pool a little bit of data together, right? And that will also help us to be able to tie together, kind of, it'll be a lab activity, but tie together cardiovascular, respiratory, and renal, like all this stuff, right? And pull it all together, and we'll do sort of like little group graphs. All right, so try and be sure you know where those are, right? For that day, when that day comes. Okay. And then, okay, so I guess it looks like after that we're in mid-November, and we'll be moving on to digestive and all the rest, right? We'll just scroll down, and then there we are. After Thanksgiving, so we have that Thursday the 27th off for Thanksgiving, and then we'll come back, and that following week, first week of December, unbelievable, we'll have the endocrine presentations. So I had sent out an email that had all of the group assignments, right? Did everybody take a look at that? Everybody got a look at that? All right. So so I've got those. Maybe after the break we can have a few more words, right, about that, just to like sort of get everybody moving on that. So we'll do that after the break. Let's see. Not too much to say though. Good. So let's move on to respiratory. There it is. All right. Recording devices. That's good. Let's see. So of course, anatomy review, right? So just go over that. You guys know it all. That's good. More anatomy review. This is just emphasizing that all of those airways, we start out with one big airway trachea, and then we branch, and we branch, and we branch, and we branch. Do not worry about these numbers over here about how many branches, right? We're just remembering to keep branching, right, to get that bronchial tree. And then at the end of the bronchial tree, we're remembering alveoli, right, our air sacs. And very important to also remember how those capillary beds surround each alveolus, right? Kind of wrapping each alveolus like a little net or something like that. So we're definitely going to remember that. And also review from anatomy, just overall functions of conducting zone, which is that upper airway. So just review that. And, oh my goodness, be sure that you remember this respiratory membrane structure, also from anatomy. So just to spend an extra moment on it, this is the wall of the alveolus sliced so that we can see how to build the wall. And we had type 1 alveolar cells, right? They're squamous cells and arranged in a simple, right, arrangement. So one layer, simple squamous epithelium. And then we have a little bit of interstitium in there, and then we have our capillaries wrapping on the outside. And of course, we already have reviewed a zillion times. Capillaries are endothelial cells and other simple squamous epithelium, right? With a little bit of loose connective tissue around that. So, like areolar connective tissue around that. So our respiratory membrane, right, was a simple squamous cell, right, our type 1 alveolar cell, a little bit of basement membrane, right, an interstitium in there, and then another simple squamous cell, the endothelial, cell, right? So we had kind of 1, 2, 3, and those 3 layers were all very thin layers, right? That's the point of the respiratory membrane, have these 3 really, really thin layers so that our gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, can easily and quickly, right, diffuse through those 3 layers. Good? All right. Also take note, before we leave this slide, be sure that you have back in the front of your head, right, what are type 2 cells? What are type 2 cells?
Macrophages.
Not macrophages. Though we have macrophages there, right, lining the inside of those alveoli because we do not produce mucus once we're down here. So we have to have some sort of defense, right? So we have macrophages floating around. But type 2 cells, what do they produce and secrete?
Mucus.
Not mucus, not mucus. We're not producing mucus this low. Oh yeah, something to keep the cells from sticking. What was that stuff? It does. There is an F in there. It's about in the middle of the word. There's an F. Huh? And the beginning of the word is with an S.
Surfactant.
Oh, surfactant. Oh my gosh. Okay. Good. Okay. I was like, I should do like a whole outfit with Vanna White, right? And we'll do letters and the whole thing, right? So, okay, so surfactant, right? We're going to have a big discussion about surfactant a little bit later. But let's put it back in the front of our heads from anatomy. So type 2 cells kind of hanging out inside those alveoli, producing and secreting surfactant. We'll talk more about surfactant, right? A little bit later. Okay. You should also remember this from anatomy. Oh my goodness, right? How to create these serous cavities, right? And in particular, of course, the serous cavities in charge of holding the lungs, right? Which are pleural cavities. So let's remember, one pleural cavity, right? Lungs, and this would be like chest wall, right? And lining the inside of the chest wall, remember? Parietal pleura, and then sticking to the outside surface of those lungs, visceral pleura, right? And then we had our space in between, technically our pleural cavity, right? And inside this pleural cavity, fluid, right? Pleural fluid. Here they're saying intrapleural, it's fine. Inside of the pleural cavity, fluid. Good? All right, and what was that fluid for? Like, why is the fluid there?
All from no friction.
Yes, there's no friction, right? Because we have the chest wall expanding, we have ribs. We have lungs expanding inside that chest wall, and we don't want them to, right? So we reduce friction by having a little layer of fluid in there. All right, in our discussion, right, that's coming up right at the top of this lecture, this space is going to become hugely important. So let's be sure also that this is the front, right, from anatomy. Okay, very good. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Oh man. So, actually, this should be kind of an overview as well. So this is just our overview. It's just starting to look a little scary, but this is just a little overview about all the steps that have to happen, right? Basically, in the respiratory system. So we're going to take air, right? Air in the atmosphere in, right? We'll take that in, and we're going to see this sort of style of drawing throughout this whole chapter. So this is a nice sort of simple, like not easy, but simple way to like get ourselves into this style of drawing. So we'll have this little pouch here representing an alveolus, right? And you see that the air is coming in and filling the alveolus. It's just moving. Like we haven't done anything to the air, right? The air has just entered into the space. So we see our alveolus, a representation anyway of an alveolus, and then some air, right? And we have arrows going back and forth. And we're focusing on oxygen and carbon dioxide because that's what we are going to use. There's other stuff in the air. There's actually a lot of nitrogen in the air, but we're not going to deal with that, right? We don't touch that stuff. It's just floating around. We don't use it. So we're going to focus on, in these pictures, even though there's other stuff, right? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, because that's what we use from the air. Good? All right. So that process of just like taking air in and eventually we're going to, oh my goodness, let me turn that off. Read that out. Ventilation. Just turn this off. There we Ventilation, so you see that up there, right at the top. And here at our respiratory membrane, we will exchange the gases, right? Allow those gases to pass either from the alveolus into capillaries or the reverse, right? All right, so we're exchanging gases over here. And then we see, pumping that to the heart, right? And getting that out to the tissues. And at the tissues, we're going to exchange gases again, right? Out in the capillary beds of the tissues. So we see that happening here. Inside the cells, of course, that's our goal, is to get the oxygen to the cells, right? Let the cells use the oxygen, and then the cells will go through metabolism, right? And then produce carbon dioxide, and then all that carbon dioxide is going to leave the cells. We got to get rid of that stuff. So we go back into the circulation, bring it back to the right side, get to the lungs, and then we have gas exchange again. Then we just keep going over and over and over again. So that's our little overview. All right, so we're going to start with the first item, the ventilation, right? Ventilation. So how do we accomplish this movement of the air, right? In and out. Okay, so here's where we have to talk about like a whole bunch of physics and apply a whole bunch of physics to our bodies, right? All right, so if we have a container, actually I think it's on the next slide. Let's come back to this one because, yeah. Okay, let's do like this sort of general thing and then we'll backtrack to that one. So if we have a container, right? So we'll start with this container and it has some molecules of gas just bouncing around in the container because it's gas, right? So it just bounces around at random. And that's what these arrows are showing us. They're just bouncing around at random. Maybe they hit each other. Maybe they hit the walls, right, of the container. They just keep moving around because they're gas, right? So because of this setup, those moving gas molecules create some sort of pressure, right? And we'll just call it air pressure, right, for now. Just keep it general, air pressure. All right, and you could measure that, whatever it is, something millimeters of mercury. Okay, so that's fine. If we were to take this container and reduce the volume, and you see here like they're pressing down, and so you see the volume is smaller, right? We still have the same number of molecules, like there are no holes in the system, nothing can escape or nothing can enter, so we still have the same number of gas molecules, but they're very close together now, so now they're going to hit each other and hit the walls more frequently, right? So here we're going to increase the pressure, right, because everything is bouncing around more frequently, right, kind of more like crazy. So we decrease the volume, we increase the pressure. Good? So we have to keep that. Let's keep that. And then here would be the opposite. We make the volume bigger, right, on that container. Same number of molecules, but now they're further apart. So they're going to hit each other and the walls less frequently. So there's not as much pressure, right? So we've increased the volume and we've decreased the pressure. Good? So that basic idea is the idea we're going to take with us, right, into our bodies, into the lungs. Good? All right, so let's backtrack now to, there's a name that I just noticed. There's the name Boyle's Law, right? Like that's the official name of that particular like physics law. So you should know that. Here we go. So now we're going to apply, right, this Boyle's Law to the lungs. So, and alveoli, right? So anyway, let's say here is our representation of an alveolus, right? And let's look at, let's say the starting point is the dotted line. And capital P with lowercase and sort of subscripted ALV, that's for alveolus, right? So we have alveolar pressure. That would be the air pressure inside of that alveolus, right? So whatever molecules of air are inside the alveolus at that moment, right, they're bouncing around, hitting each other, hitting the walls of the alveolus from the inside, and generating some pressure, whatever it is. You could measure it, whatever. We're not going to do numbers yet. Good? Okay, fine. So we've got our P alveolar pressure, right? That's how we're going to say it. So we'll represent it using this. Great. We also have outside, you see where it says air? Where's my stick? Here we go. All right. So out here, right out here, we have atmospheric pressure. So we'll represent that with a capital P and then ATM, right? That's going to be atmospheric. Not like getting money. It's too bad, right? That'd be better. But, oh well, we're stuck with atmosphere. So atmospheric pressure. When we're at sea level, right, everything is pretty normal. Atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. Good? So we'll just tuck that little number somewhere, right, in the head. Somewhere in there. But that, as long as we're staying at sea level, that's going to remain constant, right, this atmospheric pressure. All right. But again, we're not going to plug in any numbers just yet. All right. So far, so good. So now let's follow the arrows, right? So we're increasing the volume of that alveolus. Good? And that would be inspiration, breathing in, right? So we increase the volume of that alveolus, and based on what we know, right, from Boyle's law that we just looked at, if we increase the volume, what's going to happen to the pressure inside that alveolus? Just the pressure inside the alveolus. Don't think about atmospheric yet. So we increase volume, what happens to pressure? Decrease pressure, right? So increase volume, same number of molecules so far, but they're bouncing around. Oh, but they don't hit each other or the walls as much, so we decrease the pressure. Good? All right. So this alveolar pressure has gone down, right? Right? If that has gone down enough that it is below whatever atmospheric pressure is, right? We happened to say, oh yeah, it was 760. Okay, but we don't have numbers yet. But if that alveolar pressure dips down below 760, do you see how now we can say this? That alveolar pressure is less than, right, atmospheric pressure. So just as when we were talking about pressures, when we talked about movement of fluids, right, flow, right? Just as we had always said, well, the fluid is going to flow from an area of higher pressure to the area of lower pressure, right? Who said that? Right, for blood flow, right? Okay, we can say the same thing for air flow, airflow. So the air is going to want to move from the area of higher pressure to the area of lower pressure. And we can still call that flow. We can use the same word. We just have to be fully aware that we're talking about air, not fluid anymore, right? Talking about air. Okay. So we set up a situation by breathing in and by making that alveolus bigger, right? Have a bigger volume. We set up a situation where we had a difference in pressures, right? So that the pressure on the outside was higher and the pressure on the inside was lower. So where is the air going to want to flow?
Okay.
In, right? So the air, and you see the arrow there, the air is going to want to flow in, and it does. So that is how we pull in the air, right? We change the volume, which changes the pressure inside, right? And it's just the pressure differential, the air just moves. Make sense? The air wants to move in. Good? All right. So far, so good. Here's the opposite, expiration, which would be breathing out, right? So we're going to start, let's say we'll start here, and then we're going to reduce the volume, right? We'll make that alveolus smaller, and we'll come to the dotted line, right? We'll just go back to the original size. It's fine. Good? So we reduce the volume. What happens, according to Boyle's law, what happens when you reduce the volume? What happens to the pressure? Exactly, we're going to raise the pressure. All right, so we'll raise the pressure, and if we raise that pressure, alveolar pressure, right? If we raise that enough that it goes higher than the atmospheric pressure, we can say this, alveolar pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure, and which way is the air going to want to flow?
Out.
Out, exactly, we see our arrow, right? So the air just like flows out. Good? All we had to do was reduce that volume, and then the pressure change happened, and then the flow happened. Good? So far this is pretty good, right? Okay, so far it's pretty good. We have already said that we can use the same word flow for the movement of the air. We can also use the same word resistance and mean the same thing. Remember resistance when we were talking about blood flow was, sort of how difficult or easy it was for the blood to flow, right? Depending on all sorts of things that, well, we went over, right? So same thing here, right? We can use that word resistance to talk about how easy or difficult is it for that air to flow through all this series of tubes, right? And then into and out of those alveoli. So we can use the same words. All right, so far that's good too. Let's see. Looks like we have a mathematical equation. All right. So here's the first of our, we're going to have a little collection of mathematical equations for this chapter, especially this section of this chapter. So here's the first one. It's just our way of mathematically thinking of flow. Like we can think of flow, sort of conceptually, but we could, if we wanted to, actually calculate that, right? If we knew the difference in the pressures, right, between the alveoli and the atmosphere, right, and if we divide that by if we happen to know resistance, like we could plug in some stuff. We're not going to do a whole lot of math, right, but I think we should know this relationship here. All right. So, before we move on to the next thing, let's establish something, right? Which is F or flow, right? Okay, so let's imagine, right? Let's on our own, right? Just right now, ourselves, like, go ahead and take a breath in. Let's do that. Take a breath in, and then notice that you get to the top of your breath, right? And then go ahead and let the air out. And then notice that you're also at the bottom, right? You have a moment at the bottom. And then go ahead and take the next breath in, right? And you see how that's like a cycle. So you take your breath in, and then you have a moment, right? And then you let your breath out, and then you've got another moment, right? So these moments, right? The moment at the top and the moment at the bottom, based on just how it feels, right? Do you feel any flow of air, any movement of air at the top or at the bottom? Do you feel anything? No. So I think everybody agreeing that like at those moments you don't feel any movement of air, right? You just have a moment where it kind of hangs, right? Okay, so I think we can all agree on that. So what would the flow be as far as maybe numbers would go? If you had to pick a number, right? Huh? Zero, right? If there's no flow, like nothing's nothing, right? Nothing's happening, nothing's moving. So 0 is a good number. All right, so it turns out, yes indeed, right? Flow is 0 at those two moments, right? In our breath, right? Cycle. Flow is 0. So, what must be this relationship? If flow is 0, what must be the relationship between alveolar pressure and atmospheric pressure? Same, right? Equal. Exactly. They have to be equal at those two moments. Good? All right. So far, so good. They have to be equal. Okay, be sure that you let that one sink in really well. That idea, right? Okay, so when flow is 0, alveolar pressure equals atmospheric pressure. So far, so good? All right. We mentioned that if we were to measure atmospheric pressure, right, using some whatever barometer or whatever, right, weatherman uses, right, measure atmospheric pressure, blah, 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 right? At sea level, kind of our average number, 760, right, millimeters of mercury. I know it's in one of the slides. It might be the next slide or something. Coming up somewhere. Oh, okay, so it's at the top there. All right, great. So you see 760 millimeters of mercury. If we were to measure that using some barometer or something like that, like a weatherman, right? When I don't even know, like who decided this and sort of set this as the way of doing things when we're talking about physiology. But someone along the way decided that, you know what, to make the math easier, right, simpler, maybe not easier, but simpler, let's just reset. It's like hitting a reset button, right? Let's just, instead of using 760, let's reset that to 0. Like that'll be our 0 mark, right? And we can make all of our changes in pressure, instead of sort of real actual readings, we'll make them relative to 0, right? Relative to that 0. So from here on in, we will see a few numbers, and we will talk about these numbers and the math, right? So we're going to realize that what has happened is that instead of using 760 as our point of having 760 as our atmospheric pressure, but also when there's no flow, if alveolar pressure has to equal atmospheric pressure, then if we're using 760, what does that make alveolar pressure? 760, right? We're going to see, we are going to have some different math here from this additional math that we are going to use pretty heavily. It would be awful to be always using like 760 and then like, if you have to subtract something, the resultant number might be like 537 or 372, you see? Like it gets really ugly, right? And whoever, and I don't know when this was even established, like probably 100 years ago or something, but somebody decided, you know what, if we reset our 760 to 0 and make everything relative to 0, we can have much simpler numbers. We can have numbers like 4, right, and 0, and 8, 7, right, numbers like that instead of crazy numbers. So that's what has happened here, right? It's a little bit arbitrary, right? It was someone's idea. They do that a lot in physics. I'll tell you that. They do that a lot in physics where they kind of reset stuff. And we're just going to say, okay, we'll accept that, right? Memorizing 0 is easier, I hope, and simpler than memorizing like 760, right? And memorizing like -4 is going to be better than memorizing -367, right? Crazy. Good? So we're going to accept that we reset 760 as our 0 point. Good? So go ahead.
So if pressure's going to be at 0, then is there a baseline that alveola is going to be at, or we're going to?
That's where we're going to go from there.
Okay.
We're going to go from there. So having said that, we see that when the flow is 0, like at the top and at the bottom, there's no flow. Alveolar pressure now is not going to be. We're not going to think of it as 760. What are we going to think of it as? If our atmospheric pressure is reset to 0, at the moments when there's no flow, what is alveolar pressure now going to be? 0, right? Right. So now we're going to start with, okay, we're starting at 0 when there's no flow, right? It's supposed to simplify it, but we just have to realize that, they did something that was a little bit magical. Right? That's not what we would actually measure in the air. So we have to realize someone decided, I should look up one day, who decided? Right? Anyway, that's all right. So if we change, right, remember we went through the whole thing of like, if we make if we create the situation where the alveolar pressure drops, it's going to drop below 0, right? Like now we're going to look for numbers below 0. Good. Negative numbers. Good. Negative numbers. And here would be the opposite. When we create our situation where we cause that alveolar pressure to go up, we're going to have numbers above 0, positive numbers. Good? All right. So this is setting us up for the whole rest of it, right? Where we are going to actually look at some numbers. Good? But they're hopefully simplified numbers. At 0, we might go negative. From 0, we might go positive from that 0. Good? But 0 is kind of our new baseline. All right, we're forced to. All right. Woo! So, all right, let's do a little bit of vocabulary and let's define our 2 big super major mathematical equations that we're going to use. So, our big definition is transmural pressure. Transmural pressure. So we've got some kind of pressure. What is, not in physiology, but anything, what is a mural?
Painting.
Painting. What about the painting?
Large, big.
It's big. And usually what is it on? A wall, right? Yeah. It's usually a big painting on a wall, right? Okay. And trans could be maybe a cross, perhaps, right? So we're going to have a pressure across a wall. That's what transmural pressure means. Some kind of pressure across a wall. So let's see. If we have a wall, right? Let's say we have something like an alveolar wall, right? That's what we've been talking about, alveolar wall. We already know that we have a pressure being exerted on that wall from the inside because of all those air molecules, right? All right, and we can measure that, and we represent it with the capital P and the small ALV. All right, so there's a pressure on the inside of the wall, right? Sort of pressing out on the wall. Make sense? Okay, that one I think we can get pretty easily. We will also have a pressure being exerted on the wall from the outside. From the outside. And if we remember back to the picture that was our anatomy review of the pleural membranes, right? The pressure that's being exerted on the outside of these alveoli is coming from that intrapleural space. Good? Intrapleural space, that space, is exerting some kind of pressure on the alveolar walls, but it's outside, right? It's outside the alveolar walls. So far, so good? So you see how we have a pressure on the inside of a wall, it's kind of pushing out on the wall, and we have a pressure on the outside of the wall, it's kind of pushing in, right? So we can measure the difference between those 2 pressures, right? There's a wall in between, but we can measure the difference between those 2 pressures, right? And that would be our transmural pressure, the pressure difference across the wall, right? Maybe you could think of it as like through the wall, right? But we usually say across the wall. And the way we're going to write that as a mathematical equation, let's look over here at this particular type of transmural pressure. It's called transpulmonary pressure. So transpulmonary pressure is that pressure difference across that alveolar wall, right? That alveolar wall. So here's how we would write that as a mathematical equation. We'll represent transpulmonary pressure with capital P and then the lowercase and subscripted TP, transpulmonary, right, pressure, equals, and let's take alveolar pressure, which is the pressure on the inside pushing out on that wall, right, we know what that is, minus, here's our new one, here's our new pressure, P and then IP is going to be intrapleural, but we know that, I mean, we're going to know it now, right? But we know that that's that space, that pleural space. So we can measure a pressure in that little space. Okay. And that pressure is pushing in on all those alveoli. Good? Pushing in from the outside. So we can use these two pressures, the one on the inside, the one on the outside, and say, okay, the one on the inside minus the one on the outside gives us this pressure difference called transpulmonary pressure. Good? If we had some numbers, we could plug in numbers, right? And actually calculate some numbers, right? And assign numbers, which we'll do. Good? All right, but first don't do numbers. Just think. Okay. So we've got that. So that's one, transmural pressure. We've got another one. So our second transmural pressure is across the chest wall. So let's remember back to anatomy and that reminder slide about the serous membranes, right, the pleural membranes. So we had the lungs covered with visceral pleura, and we had the chest wall, right, on the outside lined with parietal pleura, right? So that's two separate walls with a space in between, right? So we do have that outside wall, the chest wall made up of ribs, and what muscles are in between the ribs?
Intercostals.
Woo, intercostals, right? How many layers of intercostals? Two, good. What are they? Internal, external. Woo! Woo! Not even pauses in there. All right, so internal and external intercostals in between those ribs. So we've got that, skin, right? All this stuff making up the chest wall. Plus, of course, don't forget our parietal pleura lining the inside of that. So that's our chest wall, right? So we will have pressure on the inside of the wall. That's that intrapleural pressure, right? In this case, because we're thinking of the chest wall, that intrapleural pressure is pressing out, isn't it? Right? It's pressing out on the wall. And so let's start setting up our mathematical equation. Chest wall, CW, pressure of, right? Pressure of the chest wall. Equals, there's that intrapleural pressure, that's the one on the inside, minus, and what's on the outside of the chest wall? Air, right? So that's atmospheric pressure. So this is our mathematical equation to calculate the pressure difference across the chest wall, right? The lungs really have nothing to do with this. You see that? It's just the chest wall, just ribs, muscles, and skin, and parietal pleura, right? Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about the alveoli, the interpleural pressure is from the outside, but when you're talking about the chest wall, it's from the inside.
Exactly. So let's see. So here's the first thing before we look at the picture, because then I have a picture in that, and then you'll see, right? We do see, just looking at just the equations, we see overlap, right? We're using intrapleural pressure in both equations. Intrapleural pressure is always going to be like intrapleural pressure, right? Just because we use one equation or the other equation, we're not going to, just because we're using a different equation, use a different intrapleural pressure, right? But you see how here when we calculate transpulmonary pressure, intrapleural pressure is over here, right? And yes, it's pressing, it's like pushing on that alveolar wall from outside of it, right? And then here, when we look at the chest wall, we're putting intrapleural pressure first, right? And that is pushing out from the inside of the chest wall, right? Just because that's where the intrapleural space is. It's between the two walls, right? And so let's also notice that with these two equations, we're always saying the inside pressure minus the outside pressure. Good? So if you kind of like have a moment and you forget, like, oh no, which one comes first, right? Just like take a deep breath, right? Think of the setup, right? Imagine your two walls and the intrapleural space, right? And just remember inside minus outside, right? And that'll be your pressure across the wall. Inside minus outside. Good? All right. So, we've got 2 walls and 3 spaces, right? We've got our space inside the alveoli, we have our space inside the pleura, and we have our space outside our bodies. Good? So that's our setup. That's our setup. Oh, this is just a YouTube video. You guys can go through this, kind of on your own. It's just a nice visual, little animation kind of thing. So you can go through that, but we're going to just keep talking. So here is a visual representation of what we were just talking about, right? Those mathematical equations. So let's see, what is our setup, right? So that we can visualize. So we've got this kind of schematic diagram. This green line represents chest wall. This purple line could represent an individual alveolus. It could represent a lung, right? A lung. Or we could even allow it to represent both lungs together. We could do that. So this could represent any of those 3 things, and they would all actually be the same, right? All right, so we've got that. Inside, what is that? Lavender, right? That's going to be the space inside the alveoli, right? Space, okay, filled with air. This lighter green, that's our intrapleural space, right? Intrapleural space, and then of course out here, atmosphere is outside the body. Good. So, for sure, 2 walls, right? 3 spaces. Good. So, if we were to set up our equations that we just talked about using the picture, we could say, okay, transpleural pressure is the pressure across this wall, right? This will be our alveolar wall in this case, right? So pressure, transpulmonary, is going to be the pressure of the space inside minus the pressure of the space outside of it, right? Outside of that wall. So it's alveolar minus intrapleural equals transpulmonary. Good? You see that? Don't look at the numbers yet. Okay, if we want to set up the equation for what is the pressure difference across the chest wall, we would say the pressure inside minus the pressure outside equals the pressure across that chest wall, right? So that would be intrapleural minus atmospheric equals chest wall. Good? All right, so that's our setup. So far, so good. All right, let's start at flow equals 0, right? That's going to be either the moment at the top or the moment at the bottom where we do not have air moving, right? So we already talked all about that, right? When flow equals 0 plus, we are also from here on in just going to assume that we have already reset that atmospheric pressure to our arbitrary 0 to make all the math simple, right? Okay, so we're resetting atmospheric pressure to 0, and we're saying, okay, let's start at the point where flow is 0. All right, so far so good. So we've got that here, flow equals 0, and we already know that when flow is 0, then what has to equal what? Go back to a few slides. So when flow is 0, what equals what as far as pressures?
Pressure and
Alveolar and atmospheric, right? And if we've set atmospheric at 0, then alveolar must equal 0. Okay, so far so good. Alveolar pressure must equal 0 when flow is 0. All right, well, we want to use alveolar pressure in our mathematical equations, right? Right? We want to use that. So let's plug in a 0. Because we're at these moments of no flow, right? We're just going to only look at that for now. Plug in 0. All right, so for going to accept that at rest, and we'll consider those moments when flow is zero, that's when, you know, your chest wall and lungs are resting, right? They're not moving, so they're resting. At that moment, we're going to accept for the moment, right? A couple slides later, we're going to actually say, oh, well, this is why that happened. But we're going to accept for the moment that if we were to measure, right, if we were to measure intrapleural pressure at this moment when flow is zero, and our breath is at rest, right? If we were to measure that, it would come out to, compared to zero, because we've reset everything, it would come out to -4. Just for the moment, just accept the -4. We'll see in a little bit, like, how did we really get that, right? We'll see. But just let's accept for now that we measured it, right? And it came out to, compared to zero, -4. Kudos to you. How would we calculate transpulmonary pressure? Just plug in the numbers, right? We would say, okay, the pressure difference across this alveolar wall equals 0 minus -4. So what happens when you subtract a negative number?
Positive.
Exactly. So it's going to be 0 plus 4, and what's that? Right? 4, right? Okay, so our transpulmonary pressure is +4. Huh, okay. +4. Keep that in your head, right? Let's see. Oh, what is the other thing that we've done before I move on to this one? We've plugged in these two values, right? 0 and -4. I don't know. That's a pressure difference, right? So what would be the tendency, right? What would be the tendency for air pushing, right? Wanting to move. Where would air want to move? Let me say this before you answer. We happen to not have any holes here, right? Between these two spaces, but where does the air, if those two compartments can sense each other, right? Can sense the pressures of each other, where would the air want to move? If we had a hole, if I poked a hole there, where would the air want to move? Would it want to move this way or this way?
Well, if it's negative, it won't move out.
Right, it's going to want to move out, right? This air is going to want to move out there. If I poked a hole, right? Because I'm not going to poke a hole, right? The air is still going to sense, right, on both sides. What is the pressure on both sides? And it's still going to want to move out. Well, this isn't so firm, right, that it's not going to budge. I mean, these are all lungs, right? They're quite elastic, aren't they? Brilliant anatomy, right? Let's use a lot of elastic fibers in between those alveoli. Good, right? So we can, if the air wants to push out, all right, we'll let you push out, right? So what happens to the lungs sort of overall? The air pushes them, right? Pushes them out, and the elastic fibers in between all those alveoli allow that to happen, right? Just let it stretch. Do you see? So, wow, we can actually push the lungs like outward because of this pressure difference. Do you see that? Oh, that's kind of cool, right? Good?
So if you push the lungs out,
She's looking at me sideways. Huh?
if that pressure is being pushed out, then does that have you breathe in?
Wow. Because then what happens, right? If we have now expanded the lungs, because we kind of, the air pushed and the elastic fibers allowed it to just, okay, become bigger. We've increased the volume, right? And what have we done to the pressure on the inside? Decreased it. Oh, wow. And if we dropped it below atmospheric pressure, then what? Then where does the air move? Like here in the purple space. if we increase this volume, right, and we decrease the pressure in here, air is going to come in, right, because that atmospheric pressure, if you stay at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is going to just stay the same. We're just going to say it's always the same at sea level, right? All right. So yeah, so the air is going to come in. Pretty good, right? So far, it's so good. Okay, so let's see. Okay. Here's another thing. So now we've mentioned we've like added a whole other thing, a whole new thing that we must address, and that's the elastic tissue. Oh. So that elastic tissue, what was the deal with the elastic fibers? Yeah, you can stretch them, but what was the other thing? Recoil, right? And we know by now that oftentimes the recoil was more important, right, than the stretch. I mean, the stretch is important. That just dragged the air in, right? So that was super important. But for the elastic fibers themselves, right, not thinking about the air or anything like that, but for the elastic fibers themselves, you know what? They really want to recoil. You know, just like a rubber band, right? You stretch it, but it wants to recoil, right? So it's the same with the elastic fibers. Okay, we just stretch them, but they want to recoil, right? So it's a really strong tendency, right? A really strong force. So that's what actually this arrow is representing, this tendency for the elastic tissue to want to recoil, right? And just keep in mind that elastic tissue is in the spaces in between the alveoli. So if we have all these alveoli, it's in between, right, where we've got all that elastic tissue. And so they're wanting to, you know, kind of pull, recoil, and shrink down everything, right, all those alveoli. Good? They want, the elastic fibers want to do that. It turns out that, remember we calculated transpulmonary pressure? The pressure difference across the wall, and it was +4, right? It turns out that, through some miracle, that amount of pressure across that particular wall is exactly enough to counterbalance this desire for the elastic fibers to actually recoil. It's just enough to counterbalance that to prevent the recoil from happening just yet, right? Just yet. So when we're in this situation, remember we're at no flow, right? When we're in this situation, we calculated transpulmonary pressure was +4. That +4 is exactly the perfect amount to prevent recoil, right? It counterbalances that tendency to pull in by pulling out, right? Right? So this is transpulmonary pressure wanting to pull out. This is recoil wanting to pull in. When we hit +4, they balance. Good? So at no flow, not only do we have no air flowing, but the lungs stay inflated with no effort. Do you see it? The lungs stay inflated. Like we don't have to go expending a whole bunch of extra ATP or any such thing, right? To keep those alveoli open, right? When we've stopped the flow. Let's say, I mean, either way, you could hit the top or you could hit the bottom. And if suddenly your lungs just like deflated, no good, right? So let's like build it using these very subtle changes, right, in pressures, and they're going to help balance out all these little things, right? Building, and build it just right. It's like being like a brilliant engineer or something, right? Get everything to balance so that you don't have to expend all this extra energy just to breathe, right? The basic breathing. Wow. All right, so far so good. So far so good. Let's see. Oh my goodness, we have got to finish this slide. Wow. And then we'll take a break because I know this is huge. This is a lot. But I think we're doing pretty well. So let's now look at this chest wall, right? So we can do the same thing with the chest wall. We can calculate the pressure across the chest wall, right? So all we do is take intrapleural pressure, right, -4, minus atmospheric 0, duh, right? So there's -4. Huh. That's kind of interesting. -4. So we had +4 in one wall. Now we have -4, right? The other wall. They seem rather equally balanced, right? Like on either side of 0. Right? +4, -4. Huh. Okay, so far so good. We could use that to our advantage, right? All right, so let's look at something about the chest wall. The chest wall has a tendency of its own based on its structure. We already said, oh, we got the ribs, and we got the intercostals, and we got the skin, and we got that pleura, right? So all that stuff all together, just because of its inherent shapes, right, and the tension created with the muscles and the shape of the bones and everything, has its own tendency. And its tendency is to want to sort of like splay outward, right? That would be the natural tendency of the chest wall. So that's represented, like that amount of force, right, is represented by this outward arrow. Well, it turns out that this -4 that we just calculated for that pressure across the chest wall, oh, thank goodness, it's just perfect enough to balance when flow is 0, to balance that tendency for the chest wall to want to, right? That's like zombie movie. Right, chest wall and then ribs sticking out. So, this counterbalances this. So far, so good. Wow, wow, wow. Huh. Let's remember one additional thing, which is kind of down here explained on the bottom of the slide. Remember we mentioned pleural fluid, right? Fluid filling this thin space. And let's also keep in mind that in the diagrams, they really super exaggerate this space so that we can see. But we know in real life this space is very, very, very small, right? And it just has that thin film of fluid that was to prevent friction, right? So we had that whole idea. So getting back to that fluid now that is in that space, reducing friction. Well, the other thing that it does is it does help these two surfaces, right, that are, remember they're lined by the pleural membranes, that fluid does help those two surfaces to, I don't know, kind of stick, right, because we're going to have some amount of tension in the fluid, all right, causing those surfaces to stick. So, that's going to also always help those lungs to stay close to that chest wall, so that no matter what we do with the chest wall, I know here we're at rest, but after the break we're going to move stuff, right? So here we're at rest, but if we were to from here, let's say we're at the bottom, we're going to take a breath in, right? Or if we're at the top, we're going to take a breath out, right? So if we move that chest wall, right, because of that little film, and also because of this situation here that we set up so that we can keep the lungs inflated, like always having some air in here. We're never going to completely deflate in here. Because of those two things, no matter what we do with this chest wall, in and out, this pulmonary wall is always going to follow it, right? So we'll always follow. Good? All right. That's going to be the magic, right? Is that we always follow. So that helps us also to keep the lungs inflated no matter what we do. Good? All right. So, let me just see what is next. Okay, so I know what's next. Do you guys want to take a break now? Because I know that was like a big chunk. It was really good. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 9:20, and then we'll pick up here. We're going to just add more stuff. It's good.